One of the kinds of questions that managers often have to ask is whether one thing is causing another. So specifically, like, is one action that they're taking or one program that they're running causing something else, like an outcome for their clients or their citizens? So it's important when we're talking about management to think about these causal relationships. And this really creates a kind of question. So does X, our cause variable, cause Y, our outcome variable? And when we talk about causing, we mean, is X the reason that Y is increasing or decreasing, or the reason that it even exists? So in order to establish this kind of causal relationship that X causes Y, we need to have four things. So those four things are: first, we need to have theory. Theory suggests that there's some reason to believe that X causes Y, that this is a logical thing to believe. And when you think through it rationally, it makes sense that X might be the cause of Y. But obviously, just thinking that it might be the cause isn't enough. So the second thing that we need is there needs to be correlation. Correlation means that when we see changes in X, we also see resultant changes in Y. And that if Y has changed, then we can see that X already changed as well. So the two things move together. And it's important to think about correlation, not just in terms of like when X increases, Y increases, or when X decreases, Y decreases, but also you can have inverse relationships. So you might have increases in X that lead to decreases in Y, or decreases in X that lead to increases in Y. Those are still correlations, they're just inverse correlations. The third thing that we need to have in order to establish a causal relationship is that we need to have time order. If X is a cause of Y, then X needs to have happened before Y happened. You can't have an effect happen and then a cause happen afterward. That's just not how time works. So if this is really a causal relationship, the cause, or X variable, will have happened before the Y variable. And that's not always easy to establish. It's actually one of the sticking points that we often have when we're trying to establish causal relationships. The fourth and final thing that we need to establish if we're trying to demonstrate a causal relationship is that there are no plausible alternative explanations. And one of the most common reasons for other explanations for why X and Y might look like they correlate, or it might look like X causes Y, is that sometimes there are what we call lurking variables. These are other variables besides our cause and besides our effect that actually cause or correlate with both the X variable and the Y variable. So we call these Z variables, lurking variables, confounding variables. There are a lot of terms that we use for these things. The sort of classic example for this is that you can establish that there is a correlation between ice cream consumption and death by drowning. Sorry to get a little dark. This is kind of the classic example. And so you could conclude from that correlation, when you see that ice cream consumption increases, you can also see that death by drowning increases. And if we just sort of suspend our disbelief right now about the order that that might have happened in, you can think about other possible reasons that it might look like ice cream consumption and death by drowning actually correlate. One of those things is outside temperature. If the outside temperature goes up, people are more likely to consume ice cream. And if the temperature goes up, people are more likely to go swimming and unfortunately might also experience death by drowning. So it's not that there's a direct correlation between ice cream consumption and death by drowning, but rather there's this alternative explanation, and that is that outside temperature is driving both of those things. So in order to establish a causal relationship, we would need to have good theory, which, by the way, our ice cream example does not have, right? There's no good reason to believe that that would be the case. We need to have time order. So you need to establish that the cause happened before the effect. Again, we had a hard time establishing that in our ice cream example. You need to have correlation, which means that the two variables move together. And in this case, that was the one thing that we did have. And finally, you need to rule out any plausible alternative explanations, which of course, we need to think about the control variable of outside temperature in our example. So when someone tells you that they believe that two things have a causal relationship, especially if they're demonstrating that there's a really strong correlation between those things and they want to demonstrate that that means that there's a causal relationship, remember that there are three other things that need to be established in order to really demonstrate that there's a relationship between a cause and an effect. So the last thing I'll say is this: you'll hear this a lot, that correlation does not equal causation. That is absolutely true, but it's also true that you need correlation in order to establish causation. So correlation is one of four important stepping stones on the way to establishing a causal relationship. Therefore, causation requires correlation, but correlation is necessary but not sufficient to establish a causal relationship. So when you're thinking about this out there in the wild and people are giving you news articles and research articles and policy statements and telling you that you should do Y because X and Y are correlated, hopefully this will give you a little bit of stuff to think about so that you can parse through whether that's really a causal relationship or not.